Hi, my name is Eleanor, and I'm 56 years old. Life hasn't exactly unfolded the way I imagined. My husband, Jonathan, passed away 2 years ago. He was a kind man, but distant, often lost in his work or his own thoughts. After his death, I assumed I would spend the rest of my days quietly, gardening, attending family gatherings, and reading in the evenings. Then one summer, Nathan came to visit. Nathan, Jonathan's nephew, is 28 years old, with an energy I found restless and hard to define. He had just finished a long stretch of living in the city and wanted to escape to the countryside for some peace and quiet. At first, he kept to himself, strolling through the woods or reading on the porch. But gradually we started talking about anything and everything. He had a way of asking questions that made me feel truly seen, something I hadn't experienced in years. One afternoon, as I wrestled with a creaky old garden fence, Nathan offered to help. He worked silently but with intention, and I couldn't help but notice how different he was from Jonathan. While Jonathan had always seemed distracted, Nathan felt present, grounded in the moment. Over time, I found myself eagerly anticipating our conversations. There was a lightness in his presence, a sense of possibility that I hadn't felt in years. One day, as sunlight filtered through the trees, I decided to tackle a long overdue task: cleaning out the attic. The thought of sorting through the memories and dust had kept me from it for years. I tied my hair back, grabbed a few old boxes, and started sifting through them. Nathan appeared in the doorway, his shirt damp from the summer heat. "Need a hand?" he asked, a slight smile on his face. Before I could answer, he stepped inside and hoisted a heavy trunk with ease. "Careful," I said. "That's probably older than both of us combined." He chuckled, setting it down gently. "Good thing I'm here then." As we worked, we uncovered a box of old photographs. I couldn't help but smile as I showed him pictures from my younger years. He studied each one intently, his green eyes thoughtful. "You were beautiful," he said softly, holding up a photo of me in my 20s. I laughed, brushing the comment aside. "That was a long time ago." "It doesn't matter," he replied, his gaze lingering on the picture before meeting mine. There was something in his eyes, unspoken but undeniable. The air in the attic seemed to shift, growing heavier with the unspoken tension between us. I quickly looked away, focusing on the box in front of me. These old things, they're just reminders of a life that feels so far away now. Nathan moved closer, his voice low. "Maybe it doesn't have to feel so far away." I froze, unsure how to respond. His words hung in the air, heavy with a meaning I wasn't ready to confront. "Eleanor," he said gently, his hand brushing mine as he reached for another photo. "You don't have to do this alone. Life doesn't end just because someone you loved is gone." I looked up at him, my heart pounding. There was so much I wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, letting his words sink in. That evening, the house felt quieter than usual. Nathan had gone out for a walk, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat on the porch, a cup of tea in my hands, watching the sun dip below the horizon. My mind kept drifting back to the attic, to the way Nathan's words had stirred something deep within me. When he returned, his cheeks were flushed from the cool evening air. He sat down across from me, his expression thoughtful. "Are you okay?" he asked, breaking the silence. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. "Just thinking," I replied. "About what?" he asked. I hesitated, then decided to be honest. "About what you said earlier, about not doing this alone." Nathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I didn't mean to overstep," he said softly. I see how much you're carrying, and I know what that feels like." His words caught me off guard. "You do?" He nodded, his expression serious. "Losing people, it changes you. It makes you feel like you have to hold everything together by yourself. But you don't, Eleanor. You don't have to." There was something earnest, almost pleading in his voice that made me believe him. For the first time in years, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to lift, even if just a little. We sat there in silence for a long time, the quiet between us strangely comforting. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated. "Good night, Eleanor," he said softly. "Good night, Nathan," I replied, watching as he disappeared into the house. The next day, I found myself searching for excuses to spend time with him, whether it was fixing things around the house or working in the garden. I felt inexplicably drawn to his presence. One afternoon, as we planted flowers along the fence, I asked him about his life in the city. He spoke of long work hours, feeling out of place, and a longing for something more. "Is that why you came here?" I asked. He nodded, his hands brushing the soil. "I guess I was hoping to find some clarity, or at least a little peace." I smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. "You've come to the right place for that." He looked up at me, his green eyes searching mine. "Have I?" he asked, his voice low. The question hung in the air between us, filled with meaning I wasn't ready to face. Instead, I turned back to the flowers, my hands trembling slightly. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was beginning to shift between us. Nathan sat at the kitchen table, flipping through an old photo album I had left out earlier. His fingers moved gently across the pages, pausing occasionally to study a picture. "Is this your wedding day?" he asked, holding up a photo of Alfred and me standing in front of the church. I nodded, placing the pot on the stove. "It was a lifetime ago. You look happy," he said, though his tone carried an undertone of something else. Curiosity, maybe even sadness. "We were," I replied, focusing on the vegetables I was chopping. "In our own way." Nathan closed the album and leaned back in his chair, his gaze lingering on me. "And now?" he asked softly. I stopped chopping and turned to face him. "And now, I'm figuring out what comes next." Nathan's eyes softened, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. As the days passed, Our conversations deepened. He opened up about his childhood, his aspirations, and the moments that left him feeling lost. I, in turn, shared stories I hadn't spoken of in years. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching fireflies flicker in the dark, Nathan turned to me. "Do you ever think about starting over?" he asked. "Starting over?" I repeated, unsure of his meaning. "Yeah," he said, "leaving the past behind, finding something new, someone new." His words caught me off guard, but I held his gaze. "I don't know," I admitted. "I guess I've always thought it was too late for that." "It's never too late," he said softly, his voice steady. The turning point came on a rainy afternoon. The storm had arrived suddenly, leaving us stuck inside. I was in the living room, sorting through old books, when Nathan joined me. "Need a hand?" he asked warmly. I smiled. "Sure, these can go in the donation pile." As he knelt beside me, our hands brushed briefly. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a spark through me, a reminder that I was still alive. "Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. I looked up, meeting his gaze. His green eyes held an emotion I couldn't quite name, something that quickened my heartbeat. Before I could respond, he reached out and took my hand in his. "You're not alone," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "Not anymore." In that moment, the walls I had built around myself began to crumble. The days that followed were a blend of clarity and confusion. Nathan and I had crossed an invisible line, one neither of us fully understood. Yet, I couldn't deny the comfort and spark his presence brought to my life. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves drifted to the ground, Nathan and I decided to take a walk in the woods. The silence between us was warm, not heavy, as though words were unnecessary. At one point, we stopped in a small clearing. He turned to me, his expression serious. "Eleanor, I've been thinking," he began, his voice hesitant. I raised an eyebrow, encouraging him to continue. "I don't know where this path leads," he said, gesturing between us. "But I do know I don't want to walk it without you." His words took my breath away, touching something deep within me, something I hadn't felt in years. "Nathan," I began, my voice trembling. "I don't have the answers. I don't even know if I'm ready to find them." He smiled gently. "Then let's figure it out together." The simplicity of his response brought tears to my eyes. For so long, I had carried the weight of my past alone, convinced it was mine to bear. But here was Nathan, offering to share it with me, without judgment or expectation. As we stood in the clearing, the wind rustling the trees around us, I realized something. Life doesn't always give us neat resolutions or perfect endings. Sometimes it simply offers us a chance to begin again. I reached for his hand, intertwining my fingers with his. "Together," I echoed, a small smile spreading across my lips. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, we sat on the porch with a blanket draped over our shoulders. The air was crisp, and the sky was painted in shades of pink and orange. For the first time in years, I felt at peace, a quiet contentment in knowing that while the road ahead was uncertain, I wouldn't be walking it alone. Nathan glanced at me, his green eyes warm. "You know," he said, "I think this is the beginning of something good." I nodded, my heart feeling light. I think so, too. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the world and the promise of tomorrow, I allowed myself to believe it. The past was still a part of me, but it no longer defined me. As for the future, well, that was ours to create.